it says, "We have heard with our ears, O God, our fathers have told us the deeds you did in days of old. You drove out the nations with your hand, but them you planted, you afflicted the peoples and cast them out. For they did not gain possession of the land by their own sword, nor did their own arm save them. But it was your right hand, your arm, and the light of your countenance, because you favored them. You are my king, O God, command victories for Jacob. Though you will push down our enemies, though your name we will trample those who rise up against us. For I will not trust in my bow, nor shall my sword save me. But you have saved us from our enemies, and have put to shame those who hated us. In God we boast all day long, and praise your name forever. But you have cast us off and put us to shame, and you do not go out with our armies. You make us turn back from the enemy, and those who hate us have taken spoil for themselves. You have given us up like sheep intended for food, and have scattered us among the nations. You sell your people for next to nothing, and are not enriched by selling them. You make us a reproach to our neighbors, a scorn, a derision to those all around us. You make us a byword among the nations, a shaking of the head among the peoples. My dishonor is continually before me, and the shame of my face has covered me, because of the voice of him who reproaches and reviles, because of the enemy and the avenger. All this has come upon us, but we have not forgotten you, nor have we dealt falsely with your covenant. Our heart has not turned back, nor have our steps departed from your way. But you have severely broken us in the place of our jackals, and covered us with the shadow of death. If we had forgotten the name of our God, or stretched out our hands to a foreign God, would not God search this out? For he knows the secrets of our heart. Yet for your sake we are killed all day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. Awake! Why did you sleep, O Lord? Arise, do not cast us off forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our affliction and our oppression? For our soul is bowed down to the dust, our body clings to the ground. Arise for our help, and redeem us for your mercy's sake.
Thanks, brother, so much for reading that. I know it's a lengthy chapter, a lengthy psalm. I know that I've mentioned before to you, brethren, that I have been told that as time goes on, the psalms become more and more rich and more meaningful. And I'm certainly seeing how that can be the case as you're looking here at the circumstances and the predicament of God's people as this is being described and laid out for us. And we're going to study this tonight together. We're going to break it down into 4 major points, and we're going to then apply and make application and consider various ways in which this psalm not only makes sense in the context of the way in which it was written, but also makes sense to us in our lives so that we can apply it and we can feast on it for our own spiritual benefit so that God can be glorified. We understand that Romans chapter 15 and verse 4 tells us, whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning. That we can go back to the Old Testament, we can go back to these types of passages, types of chapters, and we can learn from them, and we can then leverage them for our own benefit and for God's glory in the New Testament era. Notice with me verses 1 through 8, we see the past. We're then going to notice verses 9 through 14, the punishment, verses 15 through 22, the persistence, and then verses 23 through 26, the pleading. Notice with me here verses 1 through 8 regarding the past. You notice that the psalmist describes here the greatness of God and the victory that God's people have been able to achieve because of him. Notice there in verse 1, we have heard with our ears, O God, our fathers have told us what work thou didst in their days, in the times of old. In other words, these people in this context were not aware, based upon their own witnessing of what God had done to the nation of Israel previously. If you go with me back to the book of Deuteronomy, notice with me here in Deuteronomy chapter 5, Deuteronomy chapter 5, and begin with me here in verse 6. I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Thou shalt have none other gods before me. Thou shalt not make thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the waters beneath the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself unto them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto the thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it. As the Lord thy God hath commanded thee, 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day in the Sabbath is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy ox, nor thy donkey, nor any of thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates, that thy manservant and thy maidservant may rest as well as thou. And remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord thy God brought thee out thence through a mighty hand, and by a stretched out arm. Therefore the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day. Notice as well in chapter 6. Chapter 6, begin with me there in verse 3. Hear therefore, O Israel, and observe to do it, that it may be well with thee, and that ye may increase mightily, as the Lord God of thy fathers hath promised thee, in the land that floweth with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up, and thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes. And thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house and on thy gates. And it shall be, when the Lord thy God shall have brought thee into the land, which he sware unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give thee great and goodly cities, which thou buildest not, and houses full of all good things, which thou fillest not, and wells digged, which thou diggest not, vineyards and olive trees, which thou plantest not, when thou shalt have eaten and be full, then beware, lest thou forget the Lord, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Thou shalt fear the Lord thy God, and serve him, and shalt swear by his name. Ye shall not go after other gods, of the gods of the people, which are round about you. For the Lord thy God is a jealous God among you, lest the anger of the Lord thy God be kindled against thee, and destroy thee from off the face of the earth. God's people were being trained, were being taught in the very beginning that the deliverance God had provided to them directly was to be well regarded and well talked of, thought of, and involved with their daily living, including the mindset and the understanding of their children. In other words, in order for the children to be aware of what God had done for them directly, those people were to carry it on and to pass it on to the children. So although they themselves did not directly witness what had taken place when God delivered them from Egypt and when God would bring them into the land, they would be aware and respect and honor the greatness of God and his work. And so the psalmist here is beginning off this passage by recognizing the past. God, we know the work that you have done. We know that we are where we are because of you. I'm not going to trust in my bow, neither shall my sword save me, verse 6. But thou hast saved us from our enemies and hast put them to shame that hated us. God, we are aware and we know that we are in the state of salvation physically and deliverance physically because of your work and because of your doing. And folks, this was a common thread throughout the Old Testament, the need to be reminded of God's greatness and of his deliverance. Judges chapter 6 and verse 8, and it came to pass when Joshua had spoken unto the people that that's Joshua, Judges chapter 6 and verse 8, that the Lord sent a prophet unto the children of Israel, which said unto them, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I brought you up from Egypt, and brought you forth out of the house of bondage. And I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of all that oppressed you, and drave them out from before you, and gave you their land. And I said unto you, I am the Lord your God. Fear not the gods of the Amorites, in whose land ye dwell, but ye have not obeyed my voice. The servants and the prophets of God are going forth, and they're pointing back to that moment that God had told them through Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and 6, and the deliverance that God had provided to them from Egypt, and was also looking forward to providing them in the context there of Deuteronomy regarding the land. And here God's people are forgetting about it. Of course, we have the cycle from sin to salvation in Judges. And here a servant, a deliverer, a judge, a prophet, a servant of God is coming forth and saying, you've forgotten. You forgot what God has done. Likewise, we see continued remembrance of this. Psalm chapter 10. Psalm chapter 10 and verse 16. The Lord is king forever and ever. The heathen are perished out of his land. Psalm 105 and verse 44. And gave them the lands of the heathen, and they inherited the labor of the people. God had made it clear, and they were trying to be reminded throughout the Old Testament time period of what it is that he had done for them. Joshua summarized it this way at the end of his work in Joshua chapter 21, beginning there in verse 43, And the Lord gave unto Israel all the land which he sware to give unto their fathers, and they possessed it and dwelt therein. Verse 45, There failed not aught of any good thing which the Lord had spoken unto the house of Israel, all came to pass. Likewise, chapter 23 and verse 14, And behold, this day I am going the way of all the earth, and ye know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one thing hath failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spake concerning you. All are come to pass unto you, and not one thing hath failed thereof. Folks, the psalmist in Psalm 44 is starting off and saying, look, I'm not amongst the people that have forgotten this reality. Myself and the remnant, the other few that are faithfully living for you, we know where the credit is owed. We know why we are where we are, why we as a people even exist. And it's because of you, God. It's because of you. Now, folks, sometimes we forget why it is that we are Christians. We begin to experience challenges in our life. We begin to have difficulties in our Christian walk. We begin to doubt and to fear. And we begin to forget what it is that God has done for us. We begin to look at being baptized into Christ as simply just an act where we were buried in water. Forgetting the power of the operation of God and it being through the blood of Christ. And because of God's graciousness, that our sins were cleansed. And that we were pulled out of the world. At which point we had no hope, Ephesians chapter 2. And we were added instead to the Lord's body, the called out, by the Lord, Acts 2 and verse 47. That it was by Him, by His direction, by His mercy and graciousness that such was possible for us to choose and to have salvation and to be in the church. And yet sometimes when the challenges begin to arise, how quickly and how easily we forget. we begin to become overwhelmed with the physical circumstances of this life. And it becomes challenging to see how an exit and how relief is ever possible. Do you not remember what it was like before you were baptized? I remember what it was like. Folks, I knew where I was going. Hell. You remember that feeling? That knowledge of knowing? If I were to die right now, I know where I'm going. And I want to fix this. And folks, he made it possible for us to be able to fix it. Then why would we forget? Why would we allow ourselves to become so easily distracted by the physical world and start thinking, wait a second, God's not going to get me out of this one. I need to go run to money. I need to go run to lust. I need to go run to self to figure out a way out of this pickle. No, folks. Who did we run to when we knew where we were going for eternity? We ran to God. And he delivered us. And the psalmist is aware of this. But yet, the psalmist also is aware that he is amongst a group of people who have chosen to oppose themselves with God. And therefore, there's punishment that they are reaping. Verses 9 through 14. They've now become a byword among the heathen. In other words, they're no longer a glorious figure. Folks used to say, how was it that the Old Testament people were able to know for certain? And how was it even that the nations around them knew about God and his people? Well, you think about even the knowledge of those who were approached by God's people in certain cases, and they would respond and say, I know who you are. And they knew of such because God's people were nothing, and they were delivered by God, and it was possible because of him that they were able to be freed from the slavery and the bondage of Egypt. And so God's people were exalted. God's people were well known and were popular throughout the world because of what God had done for them. Think about even the quote from Rahab in Joshua chapter 2 and in verse 10. She says, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when ye came out of Egypt, and what ye did unto the two kings of the Amorites, and were on the other side of Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. You were a people in bondage, yet you escaped the armies of Egypt, and now you're taking over this land. We believe in God. But here in Psalm 44, folks, they have gone far from that reputation. And they've done so because they've left the Lord. They've gone to idolatry. They've given up, and they've forgotten what he's done for them. And so therefore, even the faithful are having to take on the punishment that is being delivered to the nation as a whole because of their disobedience and their unfaithfulness. And folks, this isn't a surprise. This is something that God had made very plain to them would happen. Look with me, for example, in Leviticus chapter 26. Leviticus chapter 26. You see there in verses 14 through 39, the punishment that God lays forth for them. And we're not going to read this entire passage. But notice with me here, beginning in verse 27, and if ye will not for all this hearken unto me, but walk contrary unto me, then I will walk contrary unto you also in fury. And I, even I, will chastise you 7 times for your sins, and ye shall eat the flesh of your sons, and the flesh of your daughters shall ye eat, and I will destroy your high places, and cut down your images, and cast your carcasses upon the carcasses of your idols, and my soul shall abhor you, and I will make your cities waste, and bring your sanctuaries unto desolation, and I will not smell the savor of your sweet odors, and I will bring the land into desolation, and your enemies which dwell therein shall be astonished at it, and I will scatter you among the heathen, and will draw out a sword after you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. Then shall the land enjoy her Sabbaths as long as it lieth desolate, and ye be in your enemies' land. Even then shall the land rest and enjoy her Sabbaths as long as it lieth desolate, and it shall rest, because it did not rest in your Sabbaths when ye dwelt upon it. And upon them that are left alive of you, I will send a faintness into their hearts in the lands of their enemies, and the sound of a shaken leaf shall chase them, and they shall flee as fleeing from a sword, and they shall fall when none pursueth, and they shall fall one upon another, as it were before a sword, when none pursueth, and ye shall have no power to stand before your enemies, and ye shall perish among the heathen, and the land of your enemies shall eat you up, and they that are left of you shall pine away in their iniquity in your enemies' lands, and also in the iniquity of their fathers shall they pine away with them. God says, if you leave me, just as I blessed you and cared for you, I will likewise destroy you and punish you. My name is not going to be associated with sinfulness. And so the psalmist is declaring here in Psalm 44, yes, God, that is where we are. We are but a hiss and a byword. We are but a useless, wasteless, nothingless people. But God, we're going to persist. We as the faithful are not going to give up. We know why this has happened. We know why we are in the predicament that we are in, but we will not turn aside and give our hearts away from being faithful to you. Verses 15 through 22, you see there, and it states in verse 18, our heart is not turned back, neither have our steps declined from thy way. Though thou hast sore broken us in the place of dragons and covered us with the shadow of death, if we have forgotten the name of our God or stretched out our hands to a strange God, shall not God search this out? For he knoweth the secrets of the heart. God, we're not going to give in. Yes, we're surrounded by sin. Yes, we understand we're being punished. Yes, we know that our people, our nation has left you. But God, you know our heart. You know our mind. We know that you will know if we're trying to live a double life, and we're not going to do it. We are never going to give up in our faithfulness, in our allegiance to you. Folks, when we think about the catastrophe and the fruit that we are bearing in the America that we live in today, you know, I love my brethren, and I understand where folks are coming from when we talk about the good old days. I truly do. But the reality is, my generation is so far removed from that. It is almost impossible to comprehend. We weren't raised in an environment where everyone on the street read their Bible, where prayers were commonly said, where folks understood what it meant to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. It didn't happen. But the answer is not, if we can't get back to that, all hope is lost. Folks, that's not the answer. That's not to say I don't want to go back to that. That's not to say that it sure would be great if we had it. But the answer isn't, well, we just can't be faithful if we just continue to have the sinfulness and the catastrophe spiritually that we have today compared to the way it was back in the 50s. The psalmist is describing here a situation that is far worse than what we're dealing with today. The answer is not, God, we're ready to just give up at any moment. The answer is we will never, ever give up. Folks, Paul explains to us in Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9. He writes, and let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. What does that mean? That means if it feels like, and we feel like we are going to faint every single day in our efforts to be faithful and to cleave to the Lord, the way out isn't that that feeling will go away. The way out is when eternity breaks, when my life is over, or when the Lord returns, I am going to reap. If I can just continue to press on in my faithfulness. The psalmist says we are going to persist. And then you see finally there the pleading. Verses 23 through 26. God, we're ready for you to step in. We are ready. Folks, we don't know when the world's going to end. Period. Let me ask you a question. Is it wrong for us to desire for it to come to an end? Paul said to live is Christ and to die is gain. We sing a song, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. What are we saying there? We're saying, I don't want to be on this earth. I'm ready to go to heaven. Now, folks, I'm not saying that we need to accelerate that or anything. I'm not trying to say we need to be provoked. Don't misunderstand me here. Sometimes I think we get the idea that if this life were to end, that would be a bad thing. Folks, for the Christian, that's what we long for. We are ready. Because when that time comes, that means we get to go home and have peace. The psalmist here is desiring for the Lord to intervene and step in. Folks, I don't know about you, but I long for heaven. Long for it. And I want to do a better job pleading with God for that day. Are you here tonight, brother or sister, and have you become unfaithful? Are you out of step with God and His law? If so, we're here for you. We want to pray for you. If you need to be restored, we're here to assist you. Are you living for Jesus? Or are you living for convenience? What matters to you more than Jesus Christ? Folks, there's a whole lot of things that are going to try to get in the way. Don't let family, houses, jobs, self become your idol God. Don't forget the power of the gospel and what He's done for you. If you need prayers, need to be restored, we're here for you. If you're here tonight, you're not yet a Christian. You've not yet been baptized. Why wait any longer? Why put it off? You have the opportunity for the Lord to add you to that body so that you can be on your way to heaven above. If you have any spiritual need, won't you please come forward as all together.